Hello, and welcome to ATG, the podcast. I'm Caroline Goldsmith, Associate Director of the Charleston Hub. And today I'd like to welcome back Dr. Mark Hannell. He's the Vice President of Open Research at Digital Science and founder of FigShare. We're also joined today by Graham Smith, the Open Data Program Manager at Springer Nature. And today we're going to be talking about a collaboration between Digital Science, FigShare, and Springer Nature called the State of Open Data. This is a good partnership because you all provide services and tools to support and empower the researcher, and Mark and Graham work together on this project. It's a study that's been going on now for a period of over 9 years and looking at what people say they're doing versus what they're actually doing, and policy versus practice for researchers. And you've combined 3 different data sources for this analysis, and we'll discuss those momentarily. After all these years, you're publishing this report with its findings. What was the purpose of this report, and why is it important to go beyond the usual survey analysis format?
The State of Open Data tries to look at attitudes of researchers towards open data. It's a new part of their publishing practices. You know, for a lot of researchers, they weren't making data sets available with their research when they published their papers. And now there's a growing push from funders saying that you're going to have to publish your data sets. And we want to encourage good data set publishing behaviors, both at FigShare and at Springer Nature. And so we want to understand what is driving researchers to share their data and what we can do to help make their lives easier, because they've already got enough on their plate.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. What I would say about this is survey data is claimed data. It's what we've been doing for 9 years with this survey data, is getting a really good idea of what people say, what their perceptions of open data are. But it's not always a reliable indicator of what researchers are actually doing. And this quantitative analysis that we're adding really gives us both bits of that puzzle. It lets us look at what people think about open science and open data and what they're doing in practice. So we're complementing these 2 data types to make not just big data, but thick data. It gives us much more ability to draw insights and to analyze that overall data set.
Can you give an overview of the analysis? We mentioned the data sources, for example, those data sources, the methodology. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So with the methodology for this particular paper, this particular report, as Graham mentioned, we previously just did a straight up survey and analyzed trends over time. This year, for the first time, we have availability of quantitative data. And the main driver of that was a data set from called the Data Citation Corpus from Make Data Count, funded by the Wellcome Trust. And so I started looking at that and seeing how many links there were between papers and data sets. So as Graham said, we know what researchers say they're going to do with data, but what percentage of researchers are actually linking to a data set from their paper? So we had that as a new source of information. It's new, so it needs a bit of cleaning. We could back that up with, at Digital Science, we have dimensions, which also we can look at the percentage of papers that are linking to a data set or to a DOI from DataCite. So we use those 2 as very comparable sources to see, are the trends the same? Even though the data is new, are we seeing similar patterns? And I'll let Graham mention how we added to that with some data from Springer Nature.
So the data availability statement analysis part of this is, we've seen this growing trend within policies that these declarations, these statements are being added into research articles. This is becoming more and more standard practice within research publishing. And this gives us a different way of looking at data declarations. If we think about data citations or specific links, that tells us if a link exists or not. But it has to go through certain processes to make sure that it actually ends up in the article. The declarations gives us a different way of slicing this, I guess. So we actually know whether the data is being shared or not, and what the researcher's intentions are to do with the data. The data availability statements we are using in this context do also show a different pattern, which is interesting from a metrics perspective. If we want to think about how do we really measure the impact of open data, the fact that we have two different data sources that tell us, the trends may be in the same direction, but the figures are fundamentally different. I think that's an interesting question of where we are in terms of measuring open science anyway.
Mm-hmm. So were there any surprises to you guys in this analysis, or anything when you were looking at this and the trends that just really stood out to you?
Yeah, so when we looked at the trends, and I was encouraged that it's very easy if you look at this over time, because we know that there's more data publishing, so we can assume that all the graphs go up and to the right, which is fantastic to see that there's more data being published. So that wasn't necessarily a surprise, but when you started to try and slice the data in different ways based on the country or the funding body or the institution even, you could see there were differences. And for me, I expected if a funder has a strong data policy, we'd expect to see more data sharing than a funder with a less strict data policy or no data policy. And so that wasn't really a surprise. But where I found the most interesting findings was in the countries. And you can assume that different countries have different ways of implementing data strategies and different policies. But there really was a big variability between countries. And, we saw Scandinavia do very well. So the Nordic countries seem to have a good grasp. But when you look at countries that published less research, so if you limited it just to countries that published more than 1,000 papers a year, we saw really good data practices on the African continent, which was a surprise to me. But it's encouraging to see that there is a good take-up of research data practices globally.
Yeah, I would say one of the really nice surprises with this, or a real positive thing to see, was if we'd single out one country, was like the positive trend in Ethiopia we saw, moving from a position where a lot of data was being shared on request. We saw that really high level. It was the country which saw the biggest drop in that sharing type over the time period that we analysed. It saw very strong positive trends in the number of data sets being linked to research articles within the data citation corpus as well. And this is a really interesting thing to track against the qualitative data as well. Another good surprise, I think, was just to see that the amount of data available on request type declarations, which are a big challenge. Like, they're one of the biggest challenges if you think about the overall point of a data availability statement in enabling access. They're actually on the decline. Now, you might think that the more statements you add to more disciplines where data sharing may not be as mature, or it's being added perhaps to lower impact journals, that you would see the opposite. But actually what we saw in most regions, it's actually on the way down, which is, like I said, a nice surprise.
You were talking about the data linkages and published research earlier. Did you discover areas of correlation between the state of open data survey results and your quantitative analysis of these linkages?
Yeah, the data was encouraging. As Graham mentioned earlier, the idea that you're asking researchers about their opinions and their attitudes, and it's very easy to say things. It's very easy to say, I'm all for open science, I'm all for publishing everything. But then when the rubber hits the road and you say, well, okay, now you have to do that, how many people actually follow through with their good intentions? And so it was really reassuring to see that there was correlations between what people said they were doing and what people were actually doing. Particularly if you look at the countries again, you see areas where there seem to be low levels of education around open data by proxy of things like, are you familiar with the FAIR data principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data? Areas where you had low levels of awareness of the FAIR data principles, you saw less data sharing or linking of papers to data sets. So we could see that they seemed to match up well. And interesting for me was the fact that these might be countries with strong policies saying you have to share your data, but if the education is not happening around how or why, then you see lower rates. And so it shows you that it needs to take on every aspect. It can't just be strong policies mean that you get more data sharing. There needs to be support from the community as well and education around there. So good to see that the hypothesis is working and that the State of Open Data report for all of these years has been based on some truth.
Yeah, I would really echo what Mark's saying about that. It's that strong correlation between the level of enthusiasm for open science as well. I think that's something which is really important, because we don't want open science, open data to just be the preserve of a few and a few people who are just advocates for it. And I think there's some really interesting trends to analyze within this about how that behavior change, that culture change really comes into effect. And it's great to see actually the strong linkage between those attitudes, like the positivity around open data. You know, if you could divide up the survey respondents into those who are really advocates, I think, and then there is a correlation with the actual data sharing, you know, that goes a long way to informing, as Mark said, how we build on policies. How it's not just about a mandate, how we actually embed this within the thinking and the culture of researchers at a regional level.
Mm-hmm. So what are the key takeaways or recommendations for stakeholders?
For me, the biggest takeaway that this shows us is that the space has moved on, so that we are now entering the point at which we can start looking at meaningful metrics around data sharing and rewarding data sharing. And so for me, open academic data is an inevitability in the same way that open access publishing has become an inevitability. And you see strong policies from publishers like Springer Nature. Some institutions have good policies, and funders do too. What I would encourage, particularly the funders, is if you are a funder of research in an area that hasn't had the uptake that you wanted, or the speed of uptake that you wanted, look at other funders who are doing well, or look at the countries that are doing well and try and reverse engineer what steps they're taking. What does their plan of attack look like and how it differs from yours? And it could be some very subtle things like the word language you use in your policies. But I would look at who's having success and copy them.
Yeah, a big takeaway from this is something that we've been focusing for a while on. I think within the State of Open Data, Springer Nature, Digital Science have been talking about this. It's the need for practical support that goes beyond policy. So we can really see some of the success stories where there's been that real implementation plan, where there's been infrastructure alongside it. Because we talked about some of the positive trends here, and these are the trends overall, but there is still a key regionality to this data. And that's the one thing I would say. You can certainly divide up the data availability statement analysis into blocks almost. You can see very, very similar numbers for like types of repository sharing between Europe and the United States. And then there's another block, for example, that involves China, Brazil, and the lower block that involves a very positive trend, but still from smaller numbers with some, for example, like the African nations. So there is, like I said, this practical need to support this policy, but we also need to make sure that open science doesn't become just the preserve of a few nations.
Mm-hmm. So what conversations and interventions do you hope the report may prompt or encourage?
I think if we look at the naysayers of the community over time, you know, I used to be a researcher myself, and a lot of my old colleagues who are still in the academic side of academia, they will say, you know, I don't think data publishing is going to become a thing in my career. It's not for me. And we have the data now that shows that that's not true. It's pretty ubiquitous. Obviously, there's going to be some subject variation, but everybody is producing files. I always say, when people say, what's your data? I always say, what files are you creating? Whether it's in the humanities or engineering, or ones that people think lend themselves better to data, like genetics, where you're publishing data sets, right? So I think the conversation is around, at the researcher level, this is happening, and we're going to be able to find ways to measure how successful you are as an individual. But I think what Graham was saying about finding ways to help start conversations to show that it is an opportunity for researchers, countries to really compete at a similar level, because we want open science to be accessible. We want it to be to not live on the legacy of old publishing systems that have all of this legacy perverse incentives built in. So there's a lot of opportunity now for people in research to move forward together on a level playing field. And I think it's a great conversation to have.
Yeah, I would just build on that to say two big areas of conversation or intervention that I hope this will prompt, and I hope this will really encourage, is one about this one size doesn't fit all. And we've said this before within the state of open data. So there's a real need to address these regional challenges, and these data sources are a great way to do that. We can see, for example, around the motivations that researchers have, that they're not the same everywhere. Like the barriers holding people back from sharing, like it might be intellectual property in one area, it might be a lack of infrastructure and resources in another area. In some cases, it might be poor skepticism. These are also equivalent to the success stories. If you can really focus on where those success stories are, different regions will be more suitable, I guess, as sort of role models in this area. And it's great to actually broaden this out. Like if we can actually really shine a light on some of these areas that are doing very well. The second point I would say is really around this conversation about metrics, which has been a big gap around open science for quite a long time. Open science has for quite a time been embedded within policies and discussions. And now we're seeing a lot of initiatives like the Open Science Monitoring Initiative, for example. PLOS have had their open science indicators for a while that have really led to this point. And it's great that we're actually talking about this, but there isn't a lot of standardization of the metrics or agreement about what success actually looks like in terms of, say, open data sharing. And we hope this report, by complementing this quantitative analysis, helps really to feed into that discussion.
Yes, you guys were talking about changes and driving change. So you say this new analysis and different approach will help bring about these changes. How do you think that's going to happen?
This is the part that I'm really excited about the most here, is the fact that, we've worked in the academic open data space now for both myself and Graham for more than a decade, and we have this kind of carrots and sticks approach to driving societal change in academia, right? Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. And we've only ever really been able to do the sticks. The National Institute of Health brought out a data policy in January 2023 saying, if we fund you, you have to make your data available, right? So it's just a chore for researchers. It's more work for them to do. But what's in it for me? Why would I, as a researcher, want to do this? How is it going to help my career? And by opening the conversation on metrics and saying, we have a way in which we can compare through open corpuses like the data citation corpus, we can compare across wherever you publish your data. We can start putting metrics around the impact or the reuse that data is having, and we can reward you for that. So being able to compare how much impact your research data is having compared to other researchers allows funders to start rewarding you for that. And we're seeing, again, the start of that. The NIH are putting out a call for proposals for something called the S-index. I don't necessarily love indexes, but I'm encouraged that we can do this. And so they're asking people to come up with an algorithm which demonstrates how good someone is at data sharing. And so now we have the funders saying, we can reward you for making your data openly available. And we're at the point where we can have carrots and sticks, and it should speed up the amount of data that's being made available, and researchers' attitudes towards it. It should reward them for going the extra mile and describing their data well and things like this, and going to the trouble of making it openly available, because it takes time.
Yeah, again, I would really agree with this. Rewards as a big part of the the missing gap really within open science. I already mentioned about metrics, and I think that sort of ties into this wider kind of elephant in the room, which is research evaluation, of which metrics can be a part, and we don't want every metric to turn into, an index. But if we can move the conversation on and start to think about the rewards, then that's one of the most positive things I think this kind of survey and complementary quantitative analysis can do. Again, I would say the specific targeting of interventions in areas is something else we can really focus on here. So we can start to have those conversations at a regional level that start to really pin down, okay, well, what is it about the infrastructure or the research culture in these particular locations, and what can we actually do about that? And I would say that's a two-way thing as well. Like, you could see open science as a way to enable better research culture, but it could also be the other way around. And this gives us the ability to really understand, I think, what's happening in different areas from that perspective.
And what are your hopes for the future of the open data space and open research more specifically?
Yeah, my hopes for open research is it's just research, that everybody has access to. We shouldn't need to put the word open in front of it. If it's taxpayer funded research, it should be openly available. So, people outside of academia can read the papers and make their own informed decisions. And more interestingly now, the robots can read the papers and read the data sets. And I think my hopes for open data are that they drive solving the world's challenges. If you look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, climate, poverty, every one of those things needs data-driven decisions or the opportunity for paradigm shifting research happening because we have AI agents helping us process large swathes of data. And we're seeing this already with two of the Nobel Prizes had an AI element to it. One of them, interestingly, was the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, which was won for predicting protein folding structures. And it's based on an open database called the Protein Data Bank. And I think it highlights the opportunity and the concerns imperfectly, which is everybody who made their data openly available through the Protein Data Bank has ultimately helped to create something that is so insignificant that it's won the Nobel Prize. But they didn't get any reward for it. They didn't get any credit for that, the hundreds of thousands of researchers who've done that. So I think you see the opportunity is huge, but if we're going to incentivize people and give people metrics for rewarding them, we need to get it right and we need to do it in a consistent way. So I'm very hopeful and I'm very excited, but there's a lot of checks and balances that need to be done in this exploratory phase. So I hope that open data is fair, and that is fair in the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, but also fair to researchers.
Yeah, I mean, my hope within this perspective, as somebody who works on open data, at a publisher, is that it becomes the thing that is expected. Like, it's not seen as a barrier towards getting the article published. Your data, your code, your precurrents, your protocols, this is all part of your research outputs, and it should be valued on the same level. And in order to do that, I think we're actually at a great turning point where there is a lot of potential practical application of open science. And some of that involves automation, but a lot of it involves, I think, getting the reward and the credit for actual data professionals and those data experts. A lot of the time, that's the researchers themselves. But I would say that recognition of the data, almost industry, you would call it, the data part of research, feeding into like this wider open culture. That's really the dream, I think. And like I said, I think we are at a stage where that is becoming more achievable. But it needs to move out of this purely policy and discussion phase into something that's, practically applied.
Have the results of the report officially been published? Are they available now?
They are available if you Google State of Open Data, you will find all of the State of Open Data surveys over the years. If you Google State of Open Data 24, you will get this year's one that links to the data as well. We eat our own dog food. The data behind the survey is made openly available. So it's very discoverable, and it's all, of course, published on FigShare.
Okay. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes for the podcast. And we'll also put that QR code in the video on our YouTube channel. So Mark and Graham, thank you guys so much for joining us today in the podcast and for talking to us about this report that you've been working on for so many years now, almost a decade in. That's amazing. So I can't wait to read it. And thank you guys again.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Many thanks.
Thank you.